Hello friends, welcome to another video of the channel. Today we will analyze one of the most impactful episodes of the recent international scene. Hamas's attack to Israel on October 7, 2023. This event triggered a dramatic sequence of military, diplomatic, and political actions, whose consequences follow shaping the geopolitics of the Middle East to this day. The offensive resulted in more than 100 dead and approximately 250 people kidnapped, generating a deep shock in both Israel and the international community. This attack was particularly surprising because it occurred in a moment of relative calm in the region. Until then, there was a non-official truce between Israel and Hamas, and negotiations to maintain stability in Gaza were promising. The local population lived a rare period without major military clashes, which precisely contributed to the attack to take everyone by surprise. Hamas's action was massive and brutal. Combatants broke the Israeli security barriers, invaded communities near the Gaza Strip, and launched a series of coordinated attacks. This type of earthly raid, associated with rocket launches, has created a situation of chaos and terror in several Israeli cities near the border. Immediately, Israel's government and defense forces, the famous IDF, reacted with extreme strength. A massive military operation was launched, whose declared objective was to destroy Hamas's infrastructure and neutralize its ability to continue attacking. As is well known, one of Hamas's recurring practices is to hide in densely populated urban areas, using schools, hospitals, and even residential areas such as human shields. This complicates and aggravates any military response, as Israeli operations inevitably also reach the civilian population. And that's exactly what happened. Israeli bombings reduced the rubble most of the urban areas of the Gaza Strip. Reports point to thousands of civilian victims, including women and children, causing a humanitarian crisis of gigantic proportions. It is important to highlight that, despite the humanitarian impact, Israel's military strategy was focused on dismantling Hamas's command and control. And in fact, the effects were significant. The leadership of the terrorist organization was almost fully eliminated, including important commanders who worked directly in the Gaza Strip. In addition, Hamas's operational capacity has been severely reduced. Before the attack, the group had a well-organized structure of arsenals, tunnels, and command centers. After weeks of Israeli offensive, this infrastructure was deeply compromised, placing Hamas in a situation of enormous military fragility. However, even in the face of this military defeat, Hamas continues to exist as an active, although very weakened terrorist organization. It is worth remembering that over the last few decades, even after successive military blows, the group has always found ways to restructure, maintain its power over Gaza, and continue to represent a threat to Israel's safety and the region's stability. While the bombs fell on Gaza and the world was in the world's climbing violence, a question began to emerge. Why did Hamas decide to attack at that moment? What motivated this brutal offensive, knowing that it would cause equally devastating retaliation? Now that you have understood how was the attack and immediate response of Israel, we need to dive into what really motivated this Hamas action. Unlike what many initially thought, the attack of October 7, 2023 was not an isolated act, nor a simple act of resistance or despair. It was, in fact, a deliberate and carefully planned strategy to cause a specific political effect, to sabotage peace negotiations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Until then, these negotiations advanced quickly. Israel and Saudi Arabia were very close to formalizing a historical agreement of normalization of diplomatic relations. This movement was part of the so-called Abraham Agreement, which had been expanded since 2020 with the support of the United States and aimed to create a new political configuration in the Middle East. However, this approach between Saudis and Israelis represented a direct threat to Hamas and the Palestinian cause as a whole. After all, with Saudi Arabia, the largest Sunni power in the Islamic world, sealing peace with Israel, the Palestinian struggle would lose even more protagonism in the international scene, being seen by many Arab countries as an outdated or secondary cause. Hamas, therefore, decided to act before it was too late. The strategic calculation was clear. By launching a large-scale attack and provoking a brutal military response from Israel, the group could interrupt peace negotiations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, force the resumption of international attention on the Palestinian cause, create a political and humanitarian crisis that mobilized Arab and Islamic countries in defense of the Palestinians. This kind of strategy is not new to Hamas politics. The group has used several times, throughout its history, the tactic of provoking violent confrontations to generate international repercussions and presses Arab and Western governments to act in favor of the Palestinian cause. Hamas' calculation also included the certainty that Israel would respond hard, something that actually happened. The brutality of Israeli retaliation fueled a narrative of oppression and massacre, strengthening the discourse of Hamas and creating an environment conducive to the interruption of ongoing diplomatic negotiations. And it worked. Shortly after the conflict began, Saudi heir Prince Mohammed bin Salman stated that, in the face of the new escalation of violence, it would not be possible to continue negotiations with Israel without a concrete solution to the Palestinian issue, including the creation of a Palestinian state. That is, Hamas was able to achieve one of its main objectives: block the advancement of the peace process and, at the same time, replace the Palestinian cause in the center of international political debate. But it is important to highlight, the paid price was very high. Thousands of Palestinian civilians died in Gaza as a result of Israeli retaliation. Entire cities were destroyed. The humanitarian crisis worsened scary, leaving the local population in an even more desperate situation. In addition, the attack was not performed in isolation by Hamas. There was a strategic and operational alliance with Iran and other radical groups in the region, such as Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen. Iran, Hamas' main sponsor, provided military training, weaponry, and financing for the attack. In addition, the action was coordinated with Hezbollah, which intensified the pressure on the north of Israel, and the Houthis, who began to attack ships in the Red Sea and to throw missiles against Israeli targets. This network of alliances has transformed the conflict of a dispute between Israel and Hamas into a major regional conflict. Iran, although avoided being directly involved, stimulated and coordinated indirect attacks, expanding military and diplomatic pressure on Israel and the United States. That is, the October 7th attack was much more than a simple military offensive. It was a complex political and strategic maneuver, with branches that surpassed Gaza's borders and affected all the geopolitics of the Middle East. But what were, after all, the political and military consequences of this strategy? Hamas has, in fact, been able to strengthen the Palestinian cause or ended up causing even more damage to its own people. After the attack of October 7, 2023 and the brutal Israeli response, the political, military, and humanitarian consequences were devastating to everyone involved, especially for the Palestinian people. First, it is essential to understand that Hamas, despite having achieved its immediate goal, interrupts peace negotiations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, paid a very high price. The Israeli military operation, which followed the attack, was one of the most intense in the recent history of the region. Israel launched a massive offensive in the Gaza Strip, with air attacks, bombing, and land raids, destroying much of the urban areas where Hamas traditionally hides: residential neighborhoods, schools, hospitals, and civil shelters. This tactic has been criticized internationally for years, as Hamas deliberately uses civilians such as human shields, installing arsenals, tunnels, and command centers among the civilian population, precisely to hinder or politicize any Israeli military action. The result of this practice was once again tragic. Thousands of Palestinian civilian victims, with women, children, and the elderly among the main affected. Although Hamas still exists as an organization, his leadership suffered an almost deadly blow. Many of its main commanders have been killed, their destroyed arsenals and tunnels, and their severely reduced operational capacity. The group's military infrastructure was devastated, forcing Hamas to operate more fragmented and underground. But the main political consequence was precisely the one that Hamas sought. Peace negotiations between Israel and Saudi Arabia were interrupted. Mohammed bin Salman, a Saudi heir prince, publicly stated that, after the violence triggered by the conflict, he could no longer advance with the normalization of relations with Israel without real progress towards the creation of a Palestinian state. That is, Hamas has managed to postpone or perhaps even bury for many years the historical approach between two of the main actors of the Middle East. The Palestinian cause, which was increasingly marginalized on the international scene, returned to the center of attention, with demonstrations in various parts of the world and pressures on Western governments to intervene in the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. In addition, the attack even more clearly highlighted the complex network of alliances that supports Hamas. Iran was fundamental in this process, offering logistical and strategic support for the attack, but avoiding direct confrontation with Israel. The Iranian stance followed a classic logic, stimulating the action of allied groups, such as Hamas himself, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthis in Yemen, without directly exposing himself to international risks and sanctions. Hezbollah, in turn, significantly expanded its attacks against Israel from southern Lebanon, forcing Israel to divide its military efforts into two fronts. The Houthis, from Yemen, began to perform offensives in the Red Sea, attacking merchant ships and throwing missiles against Israeli territory, further expanding the scale and complexity of conflict. This regional expansion has consolidated a scenario in which Israel was surrounded by armed groups supported by Iran, making any possibility of even more distant and unlikely diplomatic solution. Internally, Israeli society has also undergone profound transformations. The October 7th attack has radicalized important sectors of the population and the government. The pain caused by deaths and kidnappings, especially in communities near the Gaza Strip, many of them traditionally sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, caused an even larger turn on the right in the Israeli political scene. As a result, the chances of resuming negotiations on the creation of a Palestinian state became even more remote. Mutual distrust, already high, reached historical levels. Many Israelis began to see any territorial concession as an existential risk, while Palestinians, in the face of destruction and suffering, reinforced the feeling of revolt and resistance. In the end, Hamas's attack caused exactly the kind of crisis he intended: a deep shake on the political stability of the Middle East, the freezing of peace negotiations, and the resumption of the international focus on the Palestinian cause. But at the same time, it has generated catastrophic humanitarian consequences for the Palestinian population itself, further deepening the cycle of violence that has plagued the region for decades. Hamas, when trying to prevent peace between Saudi, Israel, and Arabia, eventually caused a devastating war, profoundly harmed the people themselves claimed to defend, and once again used civilians as shields in a brutal and calculated political strategy. The Middle East, therefore, enters another phase of extreme tension, with the prospects of peace and stability increasingly distant, while human suffering, especially the most vulnerable, is still the highest price paid for these strategic and political choices.